The day after Qualcomm's big announcements, ARM declared that it was canceling Qualcomm's licensing agreement. And let me give a little bit of breakdown here. So ARM is not in the business of making chips. It is in the business of licensing intellectual property, and that's about 50% of their business. So what it essentially is an upfront payment for the right to use ARM's technology in your product development, right? Apple has this, NVIDIA has this from the failed takeover bid. Huawei has this, and Qualcomm has this. A company that Qualcomm bought, Nuvia, had a license as well. And about 50% of ARM's business are royalties, and these are ongoing payments based on either the sale price of the final products or the chip price. And you typically see these types of structures when you're buying these macros. Qualcomm is primarily in the business of selling chips, secondarily in the business of selling intellectual property, primarily around 5G. So with the basis of that, Qualcomm bought, again, this company called Nuvia, the ex-Apple Bionic architects and designers. And Qualcomm used this capability to create processors for what we saw in the PC market and what we recently saw in the smartphone and the auto market. ARM is arguing that Qualcomm should pay the higher licensing fee. And again, it's funny. I asked so many people, hey, which was higher, the Nuvia cost or the Qualcomm cost? And there's also been discussions, I know from ARM, that says, hey, you might have bought Nuvia, but you do not have the right to distribute their intellectual property. So ARM is suing Qualcomm. I believe Qualcomm countersued, and it's supposed to go to trial on December 16th. So what ARM, with the 60-day notice, said is essentially you have to stop selling any chips with our licensing IP in it within 60 days. And there's two ways to look at that. And I know that, I've gotten calls from a lot of people, both sides setting the record straight with me. On one angle, you have to look at upside. So let's just say that ARM would win. It's absolute upside for the company because that incremental licensing revenue is not in their P&L now. The opportunity cost, if they don't get that, would be higher just based on the size of the revenue difference between the revenue and operating income difference between the two companies. The other way to look at this is that let's just say that ARM got a win here and they got the ITC to blockade all of the Qualcomm chips. That would mean that Qualcomm couldn't sell any of its chips with Nuvia-based architecture in it, and this might even extend to all all ARM licensing, which means it couldn't ship any of its products that are ARM-based to anybody. Now, in my mental model, and I outlined this on Yahoo Finance, is that I find that an ITC blockade is highly unlikely. And the reason is I've seen this before. How many times has Apple received an ITC block for stomping on somebody's intellectual property? I think I counted 5, okay? And how many times did the ITC say you have to stop selling in there? Once, and it was Massimo for Apple Watch sensors. Even the president of the United States intervened when Apple lost the ruling. I think it was Trump lost the ruling and got an ITC blockade. So mentally, I do not see that as an opportunity because, quite frankly, it would destroy Qualcomm. Okay, and I don't think that would be necessarily in the cards. Net, I do believe that these companies will find a happy ending to this. Their customers are not happy. Their ecosystem is not happy, and we need to get this thing straightened out one way or another. I think, like all negotiations, I think we'll land somewhere in the middle between what everybody is asking for.
Yeah, that was a great breakdown, Pat. I think there's a lot there, and I've had a number of conversations. We've had chances internally talk to executives across the spectrum. You give the background. What I'll say is a couple of things that come to mind. One is you and I both, and I've certainly followed 7 or 8 different Qualcomm cases, substantial litigation with Qualcomm, FTC, CFTC, JFTC, KFTC, Apple, Samsung, Huawei, the Broadcom attempted takeover, which is a little different than traditional. But Pat, this company is incredibly proficient at prolific almost at dealing with these kinds of situations. And so it's a very interesting sort of moment for ARM and Qualcomm, two companies that are have extensive legal sort of foundations, right? Both have big licensing businesses. Both probably have almost as many lawyers as engineers. In jest, but in serious, the joke about Qualcomm has been the world's largest law firm.
A lot of lawyers.
A lot of lawyers, and the companies have done a great job in very tough situations. And this seems to be just another hop, skip, and a jump in the life of being Qualcomm. Having said that, on the surface, ARM seems to have a very real case to be made here. I mean, I think in history, ARM has almost always granted permission to take over, to utilize license in takeover. This one never got approved. It was somewhat cut and dry in the architectural license that Nuvia had, that it wasn't transferable without ARM's permission. So on the surface, it seems like it's a pretty straightforward thing, but that's the surface. Problem is in law, it's never as obvious as what's on the surface. And so now you've got a battle. And by the way, to your point about ITC blocks and everything else that goes on, you've got a battle that impacts a lot more people than ARM and Qualcomm, because ARM and Qualcomm feed IP to OEMs and device makers that make products that end up in our hands. So you mentioned 75% of smartphones, Pat. If all of a sudden 75% of the smartphone market, and they don't have all of that 75%, but 75% that they address loses one of the biggest and the biggest, and is suddenly only what MediaTek left to provide, you would have a major bottleneck in the production of next generation smartphones. So who loses in the end? The OEMs lose, the resellers lose, the customers lose. And so that's what, to some extent makes this almost like a popular opinion battle more than a technology, is because a judge is going to have to not only rule on the law and the legal basis, but also on the impact that making any sort of kind of what I would call really substantial decision could have on the industries that these companies feed. You're talking about cars, you're talking about laptops, you're talking about phones. And of course, you're talking about a company that depends on royalties, another company that basically creates multiple very large $100+ billion valuated companies, most of the equipment or pieces of what the intellectual property they need to build their products. This becomes fascinating. In the end, I think you hit it on the head. There has to be common ground. I just do not see any situation in which these companies are not brought together to have to fight. Are they negotiating? I couldn't tell you for sure. Should they be? I think it benefits everyone in the ecosystem that they find that common ground. Having said that, I'll end where I started. Qualcomm is very good. They deal with this in stride. There was very little, you saw very little sort of emotion in this as we were around a lot of the executives this week. Seems like just another day of business. So Pat, we'll have to look closely.
No, I'm glad you pulled that up, right? Like, it wasn't a bunch of Qualcomm people running around. Like, it was just, literally like another day out there. And I know there's some discussion about, parties not negotiating, which I would just find, weird. Maybe this is a lawyer to lawyer thing, but it's this is a good one. The chip wars are I love chip wars. The only thing I like, that's second after chip wars is enterprise SaaS versus agent wars. That's
That
been
only started last week, though. That wasn't I'm joking. What did you tweet about that? Like 5 months ago, 6 months ago, you put out a tweet kind of previewing that this was about to happen on the agent stuff. That was pretty
yeah.
good.
I was sitting in Google Cloud Next, and I'm just like, oh, what Google's not saying is agents can potentially replace enterprise SaaS, which got no traction on that. But yeah, Benioff really likes Copilot here.